Welcome to The Explainer. There's this fascinating and honestly pretty sobering concept we're looking at today. What actually happens to a society when its laws exist perfectly on paper but are basically ignored in practice? It's a huge question. Today we're unpacking a really insightful piece of source material by Lawson Ahigbe, published by the Center for Nigeria Progress. It's called When Laws Become Optional: Suspicious Deaths, Colonial Legacies, and the Dignity Deficit in Nigeria. We're going to dive right into the massive gap between the strict legal frameworks a country inherited and the lived reality of how those laws are actually applied when it matters the absolute most. Okay, let's jump straight in. Here's our agenda for today. First, a high-profile suspicious death. Second, what the law requires. Third, Nigeria versus the UK. Fourth, a broader pattern. And finally, the dignity deficit. Starting off with Section 1. A high-profile suspicious death, the case of Mary Habila. To really wrap our heads around a nationwide issue, we kind of have to start with a specific micro-level event. The source material anchors its analysis in a recent, highly contested case that perfectly illustrates this entire dynamic. The sequence of events moved incredibly fast and left a lot of open questions. On June 27, 2026, a 26-year-old woman named Mary Habila died. And crucially, this happened at the residence of the Federal Minister of Works, David Umahi, in Uburu, Ebonyi State. Over the next 2 months, from June right through August, intense disputes flared up. The Ebonyi Director of Public Prosecutions actually went on record advising that a postmortem was necessary because of the sudden nature of the death. Civil society groups, specifically Sokapu, were pushing hard for an independent inquiry. Yet, despite all this pressure and formal legal advice, on August 21, 2026, Mary Habila was quietly buried in Nok, Kaduna State.
What's wild here is the sheer volume of red flags. According to the source, there were conflicting accounts of what Habila's role even was at the residence. Reports indicated her body was found naked, with blood around the nose and mouth. I mean, these are textbook definitions of suspicious circumstances, right? Yet, despite the obvious pushback from civil society, the case was just closed. No publicly disclosed forensic report establishing a precise cause of death. The body was released and buried without any formal legal closure. And this immediate lack of resolution sets us up perfectly for our next big question. What is the legal framework actually supposed to do in a situation like this?
Which brings us to Section 2, what the law requires, coroner's laws in Nigeria. Let's pause for a second and look at the actual legal architecture, because the issue here is definitely not that Nigeria lacks the laws to handle a case like Mary Habila's. Following its period under British rule, Nigeria inherited a really substantial body of laws governing the investigation of sudden or unnatural deaths. At the very core of this framework is the coroner's inquest. By definition, it's a fact-finding process designed to establish exactly who the deceased was and how, when, and where they died. It's all about establishing objective truth. And under Nigerian law, coroners are not just powerless bureaucrats shuffling papers. They have serious, robust powers. If they suspect foul play, they have the legal authority to halt a burial completely. If a body has already been buried without an inquiry, they can literally order an exhumation.
So what actually activates these massive powers? The inherited state-based coroner's laws are crystal clear on the triggers. An inquest is legally mandated if a death is sudden, unexpected, unnatural, violent, or suspicious. If a situation checks even one of these boxes, and you could easily argue the case we just looked at checked several, it is ordinarily supposed to trigger a strict duty to report, a postmortem, and a formal coroner's inquest.
But here's the stark contradiction at the center of Ahigbe's analysis. The laws are sitting right there on the books, but in reality, coroner's offices are basically ghost towns. They are among the least busy units in the entire Nigerian civil service. Some states have actually tried to modernize things. Lagos introduced a relatively detailed framework back in 2007, for example, but the nationwide reality is that formal inquests are incredibly rare. Autopsies in highly suspicious cases are frequently delayed, actively opposed, or just quietly abandoned. There is a total disconnect between the statutory requirement and the administrative reality. Let's move to Section 3, Nigeria versus the UK, a stark contrast. The source material draws a direct comparison to the United Kingdom, which is where Nigeria's laws originated in the first place, and exploring this contrast is super revealing. Look at this breakdown. In the UK, under their Coroners and Justice Act of 2009, inquests into violent, unnatural, or unknown deaths are totally routine. They are a mandatory obligation. The process is public, highly structured, and taken very seriously as a core function of governance. Now contrast that with the Nigerian reality shown here. Inquests are rare and completely discretionary. The process is delayed or quietly abandoned. And maybe the most concerning part, the enforcement of the law is heavily influenced by the social or political status of the people involved. Shifting gears to Section 4, a broader pattern, beyond one residence. The selective enforcement we saw in the Habibullah case at the minister's residence isn't just an isolated, weird event. To really grasp the full scope of this explainer, we have to zoom out. We have to ask ourselves, is Mary Habibullah's case just a one-off? Just some local administrative aberration or glitch? The source material argues a definitive no. It makes the case that the handling of this high-profile death is actually reflecting a much larger nationwide pattern. We see this systemic silence echoing across multiple layers of society. The author points out that mass deaths, like victims of terrorism in the Northeast and Northwest, often pass with little more than perfunctory public statements. There's almost zero sustained public inquiry into the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. On top of that, fatal road crashes claim lives every single day with minimal forensic follow-up. And ordinary citizens who die under questionable circumstances due to everyday criminality, they almost never see a coroner's court activated on their behalf. They are routinely denied the formal investigative rigor that the written law absolutely promises them. And that leads us to a pretty chilling realization. As Akigbe puts it, this is not merely administrative inefficiency. It is a statement about the relative value the state places on different lives. Think about that. When deaths occur that would automatically trigger official, transparent processes in other jurisdictions, the default response here is often silence, delay, or a quiet burial. The formal machinery of the law isn't actually broken. It's just engaged selectively. And that selectivity is deeply troubling because it means justice is far from blind. Which brings us to our final section, the dignity deficit. This is the philosophical heart of the source material. It moves past the legal mechanics and asks a massive question. What does this lack of consistent enforcement actually signify about the relationship between the Nigerian state and its citizens? The author argues that in places like the UK, the state's strict duty to investigate suspicious deaths is an expression of fundamental respect. It is the state saying every single life matters enough to require an official accounting. Conversely, when Nigerian authorities fail to activate basic procedures required by their own laws, even in a highly scrutinized case involving a federal minister's residence, the message is unmistakable. The dignity of the average citizen at death is treated as optional. Formal action isn't automatic. It is entirely contingent on who you are. Huckabee captures this perfectly in this quote. The gap between the letter of the law and the lived reality of citizenship will continue to define the relationship between the Nigerian state and those it claims to serve. The laws are sitting right there, ready to be used, but the institutional capacity, the political will, and frankly, the cultural expectation of consistent, impartial application simply do not exist in practice. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from the source material. The quiet burial of Mary Habibullah is only the latest illustration of a long-standing practice. It is not the exception. It is the rule. It really forces a tough question. If the laws designed to uncover the truth and protect human life are treated merely as suggestions, what does that mean for the value of citizenship itself? When a society's foundational laws become optional, who is actually safe? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we definitely encourage you to keep questioning that gap between what is on the paper and what is real.